Hello everybody, today I'm going to be talking about Shadow Warrior 2. This is kind of a hard game for me to review because honestly playing it put me in a position where it's been really hard not to just scream and rant about it, so I had to force myself to really take my time and write something sensible, although I do skirt the line towards ranting a little bit. So anyways, this is going to be a fun one I think, so let's get started. This makes up the single biggest shift between Shadow Warrior 1 and 2. Shadow Warrior 1 was designed from the top down as a single player experience. This meant linear level design. Linear has become somewhat of a dirty word in recent years, so I'll kind of explain. Linear in this case just means a guided, scripted experience with a defined direction. This can be really frustrating in games that are constantly railroading you and limiting your options, but generally speaking, a directed experience is exactly what you want. In a linear experience, the dev has much more precise control over what you experience and when. So like I was saying, in the last Shadow Warrior game, the design was very traditional. I would not go so far as to call the level design inspired, but it was very solid. What was more solid were the situations that the linear level design helped facilitate. The experience of playing through the last game's levels was predictably solid throughout. It was consistent, never off the rails or confusing. This did limit some of the ability to explore, but as most of what I wanted to do in the game involved shooting, stabbing, maiming, and generally turning enemies into a pile of meaty goo, the lack of exploration didn't really bother me or even occur to me, honestly. So my surprise was very real when I started up Shadow Warrior 2 and discovered that after the tutorial area, virtually every level is a set of objectives placed in a much larger and more open map. This has a lot of benefits, but a lot more pitfalls. For one, this brings up your chance of getting lost from around 0% to higher than 0%. I know if I give a percentage, I'm going to get negative comments telling me what an idiot I am and that XX Edgelord Haram Beast didn't get lost, so we'll just say it's much easier to get lost than the last game. The other problem is that this makes the confrontations feel much closer to Borderlands or an MMO, as there are groups of mobs, now like in an MMO, instead of enemy types and counts specific to the geography and design of the level that they're placed in. It was surprising to me when the credits for the game rolled that about halfway through I saw George Broussard, Randy Pitchford, and a few other Gearbox designers had done secondary level and game design for Shadow Warrior 2. That really explained a lot to me, and it probably will to you as well when it comes to the differing tone of this game, and the fact that it's now a closer cousin to Borderlands than Doom or Wolfenstein, for instance. This Borderlands-esque sort of feel carries through into a lot of the other aspects of the game as well, unfortunately. And these are areas such as Shadow Warrior 2 has a different approach to difficulty than its predecessor, and one that's more in line with games like Borderlands, Fallout, Elder Scrolls, and virtually any MMO you can think of. Once you move into the difficulty levels in Shadow Warrior 2 that are meant for 2, 3, and 4 players, you start to cross over into the realm of artificial difficulty. Now, I was using this term artificial difficulty for years to describe this concept before I ever realized it was the actual game design term for this, but artificial difficulty is a degree of difficulty reached by tweaking variables like enemy health, enemy resilience, enemy damage, and other simple number-based stats. This does not make the game more difficult in any real way, it just makes it take longer to kill enemies, and it's really that simple. In a game like Skyrim, for instance, the difference between the lowest and highest difficulty setting will not be in how smartly or how skillfully the AI fights against you, but in how much health the enemy has as it ruthlessly and endlessly whacks away at you. Unfortunately, it's pretty much the same way in Shadow Warrior 2. At least when you start to branch into the highest single-player difficulty and the co-op difficulties. This doesn't just make it take longer to kill an enemy, this changes the entire feel of the game. A weapon you have that may one-shot enemies in single-player now may take 2, or 3, or even 4 shots depending on the number of players that your game is set to. This makes virtually every weapon, no matter how powerful it was before, feel flaccid in co-op and is in my opinion the worst possible solution to balancing the game for cooperative multiplayer. Even worse, the harder enemy types in the game frequently are set with random properties to make them more of a challenge to deal with, kind of like the original version of Diablo 3. Weakness or resistance to certain elements, special elemental abilities of their own, and so on. This means you can possibly get enemies that have 1 or 2 properties that reduce physical damage in addition to being immune from your character's special powers. In a few instances while playing with a friend of mine, this meant for enemies that took 10 minutes or more of constant shooting, slicing, dicing, and whacking to finally kill. And I do not mean I shot, I went into cover, I shot some more. I meant consistently shooting for 10 minutes. And that does not make for a fun engagement. It doesn't make for fun gameplay, and I honestly have no idea how anyone thought that that would make for a good idea. But more importantly than difficulty are the mechanics governed by that difficulty. So let's talk about those for a second. What is it that makes a weapon satisfying in a shooting game? I personally am a firm believer that a lot of this comes down to the impact of the weapon on an enemy. This is affected by a few things. It's affected by the sound of the weapon, the way an enemy reacts to being shot by it, how quickly it dispatches an enemy, and how it feels as the player to use it. I don't know about you, but I hate spongy enemies. They make for very limp and unengaging action, honestly. The last Shadow Warrior game had some issues, but spongy enemies wasn't really one of them. Certain guns didn't feel quite so visceral, but most guns did. And melee was a legitimate blast the whole way through. Shadow Warrior 2 improves on this in a few ways, but regresses in a lot of others, I'm sorry to say. In single player, through easy, normal, and hard difficulties, most weapons feel pretty damn good, with submachine guns and rifles in the medium weapons category being a notable exception, as these were the same guns that felt limp and lame in the previous game as well. They just don't do enough damage per shot, and they lack the real punch needed for their sound, and they just lack impact overall, but the rest of the guns, on the other hand, are an absolute joy to use on the first 3 single player difficulties. They splatter and batter the smaller enemies, and make the superior and elite enemies feel the appropriate amount more threatening, which is pretty universally good. Melee also feels good in these situations, but feels somehow shallower and more ancillary than it did in the last game. Now, when you bring all these same weapons to the higher difficulties, is when you start to see some serious problems. The previous limp submachine guns feel completely useless on Insane, as well as the 2, 3, and 4 player modes for any of the game difficulties. On 2-player mode, the rest of the guns still feel okay, but never as satisfying as they do in single player, and I can guarantee you will not be killing many enemies, if any, in a single shot on any of the multiplayer difficulties. By the time you get to the 4-player difficulty mode, every gun feels basically the same. Damage is mitigated by both special properties and absurdly large health pools, and this is just one more casualty in the... I know I've talked at some length about the fact that Shadow Warrior 2 feels a lot more like a Borderlands game than the old school shooters that it hails from, but this is kinda easy to lose perspective on without pointing out some of these parallels. For one, there's the movement of the game from a linear shooter, moving from mission to mission, to a compartmentalized open world, and even level selection menu that so closely resembles Borderlands that if you cel-shaded it and let someone try it, I'd be willing to bet that's what they think they were playing. In addition, you have the artificial difficulty and even have the damage numbers from weapons. These damage numbers have the same general format as in Borderlands even. Numbers pop up giving you an idea of the damage of each weapon and each shot, with specially marked numbers indicating elemental damage or critical hits. Damage numbers do serve a purpose, but can do a lot more harm than good, as they can and will make lots of guns feel useless and underpowered. This also takes you out of the moment, as instead of just watching and enjoying what you're doing, your attention is constantly being taken by your damage numbers. This will bother some more than others, but I find the fact that the damage numbers are even there to be enlightening about the game's feel. They knew how long it would take to kill enemies, and as such, that you would need some sort of indication of how much damage you are doing to them, and something to look at while you endlessly whack and shoot away. But my opinions are not all negative. There are certainly things I liked, such as... So there's one strong element of this game that really surprised me, and that's the game's loot system. The problem with most RPGs is that new weapons and loot are generally just there to improve stats or provide a visual flair. Shadow Warrior 2 has some loot that actually meaningfully changes the feel of weapons and thus the game. There are upgrades that allow you to turn a weapon into an autonomous turret, that allow you to turn most any weapon into a spread weapon, that allow you to turn bullets into explosive, and the list goes on. There are a few dozen fire mode changes and upgrades, function changes, and other weapon alterations that fundamentally change the feel of certain guns. This makes the creation of some very personalized weapons a possibility, and fundamentally changes the experience of playing and the impact of different weapons. That's far from the most important thing about the game, but it is a sizable positive, regardless of how little I had to say about it. And yet another positive is, if, like me, you're a fan of the older Duke Nukem games, then the character, writing, setting, and general plot of this game will feel pretty familiar to you. That's by design because Shadow Warrior hails from the same lineage as Duke. Originally, both were created by 3D Realms back when FPS games were still called Doom clones. Shadow Warrior 2 honors this lineage and tradition while adapting it in a way that keeps it endearing in a modern setting, unlike Duke Nukem Forever, or pretty much any other Duke adaptation in the last 10 years. So this is going to be a very subjective factor, but for me, the goofy main character Lo Wang and his immature quips kept me pretty damn entertained all the way through, and luckily, the game doesn't outstay its welcome. So the ridiculous things he says and the interplay with him and the other characters remains entertaining pretty much through the duration of the game. Now, unfortunately, there are some things that do not hold up for the duration or for after the duration. Shadow Warrior 2 has some solid weapon upgrades, but considering how little difference there is from pistol to pistol or shotgun to shotgun, it'd be nice to see a larger variety of weapons, since the feel of all weapons is almost entirely dependent on the slotted upgrades, and not really the inherent properties of any given weapon. You know, even if the difference is only cosmetic, it'd just be nice to have a larger pool to choose from. And this is a relatively minor nitpick, because in reality the weapon pool is bigger than the standard FPS game that you might expect. It's just much smaller than a game like Borderlands, which is what this game is clearly modeled on. But a more substantial problem is the defining characteristic and defining feature of the last Shadow Warrior game was its melee and how good it felt. Unfortunately, in Shadow Warrior 2, it feels like every system in the game is sort of fighting against melee combat being a viable option. You have bullet sponge enemies that make it feel more like you are whacking a piñata than an enemy. You have superior and elite baddies that have elemental effects that damage you just for being near them. You have it where most enemies kick you after your first swing, causing you to continually have to run at an enemy, hit them once, get kicked back, run in again, hit them again, get kicked back, and so on ad nauseum. It gets tedious, and it makes melee pointless throughout the bulk of this game. Towards the end and after you've completed the main story, sure, melee starts to be somewhat viable, as long as you aren't venturing into the co-op difficulties. But in the beginning and middle of the game, melee just is not viable at all unless you're on easy mode. On top of that, melee really never becomes viable if you're playing the game on co-op difficulties. This is a huge disappointment because I loved the way melee felt in the previous game. It felt frantic and visceral, it felt brutal and engaging, and I played that game multiple times just to go through it completely with melee, no guns at all. And that's not something I plan to do with this game, not even a little bit. And speaking of not even a little bit, this was another of my greatest disappointments with this game. In the previous game, your character picks up and learns different chi powers throughout the duration. These powers generally are a means of crowd control, but can also be used to kill enemies in interesting ways. So imagine my surprise when in this game, on the higher difficulties, 90% of enemies are power immune, meaning you cannot use powers on them at all. You can spend tons of upgrade points to get a chance for your powers to affect them, and you may be able to affect them much later down the line during the game's story, but that's not the best use of your skill points, and thus you'll find yourself very rarely using your chi powers on enemies whatsoever if you play above the normal difficulty. And if you play on co-op difficulties, you can forget them completely. You aren't going to be able to use your powers aside from healing yourself virtually at all. I mean, pretty much every enemy in 2, 3, and 4 player difficulties is power immune. I get that this is to keep a group of players from perpetually stun-locking a group of enemies, but there are so many better ways around this problem that this major miscalculation is totally baffling to me. I mean, why not just apply a cooldown effect to enemies where they cannot be affected by powers again for X seconds after they were last affected, and with a larger timer for more powerful classes of enemies? This single problem makes powers almost entirely superfluous, but you've probably heard enough by now about this whole thing, so I guess let's just finish this off. So Shadow Warrior 2 has evolved in a lot of ways from its predecessor, but unfortunately virtually all of those avenues of evolution have negatively impacted the features that gave the previous Shadow Warrior its distinct voice. This is a game that I really wanted to love, because I loved the last Shadow Warrior. I mean, I went into this game assuming I was gonna love it, and ready to write a glowing review, but this does not feel like Shadow Warrior anymore. It feels like something else entirely. With Melee's viability being pushed back to almost nil, and the effectiveness of powers being reduced to essentially zero depending on your difficulty, this game went from being a sequel to Shadow Warrior to being a pale imitation of so many other shooters. I hate having to say that. I love this developer, and I usually love their work, but this is one change I cannot stick by. If, however, you aren't especially a fan of the first Shadow Warrior released by Flying Wild Hogs, or if you haven't played it at all, You'll probably find much more to enjoy about this game than I did. If you're a fan of Borderlands, in this game you will find something slightly less loot focused, but with more satisfying shooting, and as such, we'll definitely get something out of this game. But if you're like me, and you loved the last game in the series, I cannot in good conscience recommend this game to you. Because much like me, in all reality, the most likely outcome is that you're going to walk out on the other side of this experience just feeling disappointed.
And now for the subscriber fan super minute.
Hey guys, I just wanted to say I appreciate the positive feedback, and I wanted to give a quick shout out to everyone who's shared my content already and has given me positive feedback. I decided that each week I'm going to do shoutouts to some individual subscribers and people that have gone out of their way to share my content, say something nice to me, or just have gone out of their way to be good people. So this week, I wanted to thank the user Iridium Core for posting positive and motivating comments on pretty much all my work. And I also wanted to do a special thanks to Pete S., also known as CryptoTF on Reddit, for giving me regular feedback, sharing my work, and just generally being a friendly person. But anyway, that's all for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.